and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Matthew's gospel portrays Jesus as the new Moses, bringing God's law and leading God's people into freedom. Jesus expands upon 3 of the 10 commandments intended to lead God's people into a new way of life. Do not bear false witness. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Today's gospel reading begins where last week's concluded, with these words of Jesus: unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. That was kind of an abrupt conclusion. The scribes and Pharisees never met a rule they didn't follow, and Jesus tells us that we are supposed to exceed their righteousness. Today we see that there is more. We find we may squirm as much as we did last Sunday. If we are thinking we are to follow the letter of God's laws in order to earn points to save us from hell's fire and get us through the pearly gates. Where is the good news in Jesus' expectation that those who are righteous, those who are right with God and their neighbor, must be more righteous than the scribes and Pharisees? As Christians, we can think of commandments in several ways. For example, we can think of a commandment as a law, by which an action can be judged right or wrong. The commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness, can be viewed as a rule against deliberately lying. In such a view, the moral challenge is to decide whether or not something is a lie, or perhaps a white lie, or perhaps a strategic lie to spread through the gossip network to heighten anxiety, and so a person or a party can get their own way. Another way to think of a commandment is to view it as a guide in the formation of moral character. In this view, the commandment against bearing false witness is not just about obeying the law, but also about the formation of honest character. In this view, we follow God's law not just for the sake of following it or earning God's favor, but because as we persist in trying to follow the rule, we become people whose character is marked by authentic truthfulness and integrity. Jesus' message and ministry invites us to approach commandments in the second way, to view the commandments as guides in the formation of moral character. The approach taken by Jesus in this portion of the Sermon on the Plain, recorded in today's reading, follows a particular pattern or formula. First, Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said." Then Jesus follows with a statement of his own that seems to contradict the law or teaching. "But I say to you," this is not a contradiction. Instead, Jesus is intensifying the claims of the law in order to clarify and deepen its true meaning for his hearers. Jesus is following up on what he meant when he said he came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it and to teach a greater righteousness. Unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. The commandments are not just laws to be followed. They are given so that following them will form us in a greater righteousness. With God's help, as we obey God's laws, it ceases to be something external to us and is inscribed upon our hearts. St. Paul referred to the law as our tutor. It guides us until we know it by heart. Parents should remember how this works. You tell your child that the rule is that there will be no playing in the street. The child thinks you are the worst parent in the universe. Then finally, the child understands that not playing in the street is a pretty good idea and no longer has to be told that what the rule is. You teachers, artists, seamstresses, attorneys, computer scientists, accountants, physicians, and engineers know the necessity of practicing certain disciplines in order to excel at what you do. Even in the midst of uncertainties and changing times. Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said to those in ancient times, 'You shall not murder,' and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment." Jesus isn't contradicting the commandment against murder. He is intensifying it toward its fulfillment in our lives. Jesus wants us to recognize that while we may obey the commandment against murder, we may still hate and despise others. We can abide by the rule and still kill relationships and treat people in murderous ways. Jesus' teaching helps us to see that the fulfillment of the commandment not to murder is to form our hearts and minds so that we grow to view others not with anger, but with love. Obeying the law is only the first step. We fulfill the law by engaging in the hard work of reconciliation as much as the more visible act of physical restraint. It means transforming our inner lives as much as our external deeds. We will become people who will seek out one who has wronged us and work to be reconciled with him. Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in heart." Jesus isn't contradicting the commandment against adultery. He is intensifying it towards its fulfillment in our lives. He understands that while we may keep the commandment not to commit adultery, we can still do harm to others in the way we think of them, by seeing others as objects and desiring what doesn't belong to us. Jesus teaches that the purpose of the commandment is to grow a faithful heart that cherishes our spouse and respects our neighbors. Jesus' society and culture defined adultery as the male of a community being dishonored by another, having sexual relations with his wife. The law focused on the man suffering with little regard for the well-being of the woman. Jesus declares that faithfulness and respect need to run deeper, upholding the honor of men and women in a truly life-giving manner. Women must not be possessions or objects casually cast out at the whims of the man. The same was true in matters of divorce. In Jesus' time, a man could divorce his wife without turning to the courts. He simply needed to make the decision in the presence of witnesses and then give her a certificate. His words and actions would leave her bereft of any security. A community where people are disregarded and discarded, Jesus says, does not reflect divine intent for God's people. Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, 'You shall not swear falsely, but carry out the vows you have made to the Lord.' But I say to you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is the footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. Jesus isn't contradicting the commandment against swearing falsely. He is intensifying it toward a fulfillment in our lives. Jesus knows that even if we can keep from swearing falsely, we can still manipulate others with our words, raise their anxieties with our rumors and half-truths, and lead them astray with our tongues. We can make empty promises in the name of heaven, even at the altar and the font, and belittle God's holy name. The law of God demands obedience and obligations from those who call themselves God's people. The law stated that persons must stand by their words. If they had promised God, they would do so. But Jesus challenges his hearer to honor every word they speak. If we cannot trust our neighbors to speak with integrity to one another in all times and places, how can our communities experience true life with integrity to one another in all times and places? How can our communities experience true life? Jesus sees God's community as one where people speak in a transparent and trustworthy way, keeping community relationships intact, because individuals refuse to break trust for their own gain. In the baptismal covenant, when we make vows to God on behalf of ourselves or our children, we say, "I will," with God's help. We say that because we have already figured out that keeping those promises may be humanly impossible, and therefore we need divine help in order to keep them, not to mention fulfill them. Jesus teaches us that the fulfillment of the law is not just to refrain from swearing falsely, but that our words ought to be so reliable and honest that oaths aren't necessary. The greater righteousness and fulfillment of this law is to let your yes be yes and your no be no. Jesus did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Jesus came to call and form disciples into a community devoted to the higher righteousness, so that the true intent of the law might be fulfilled in them. We follow the commandments not just because they are rules. We follow the commandments so that we might become the people Christ wants us to be. People transformed and equipped for life in God's realm. Once we know that God has reached out to us through the love of Jesus Christ, it becomes our heart's desire to return the love by following and learning from his commandments, so that our lives and the life of the community fulfills everything God had in mind from the beginning. It is not easy. Time changes. Circumstances change. We change. And as a poet once said, new occasions teach new duties. So Jesus tells us to set our hearts on him, draw strength and wisdom from him, so that following God's rules will lead us into the life of God, to become expressions of what is at the heart of all the rules. Loving God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving others as we want to be loved by them. We become his disciples not by forsaking the law. We become his disciples by following the law with purpose. Our vocation is not to become moral rule keepers or judges, but so that we will grow to be people who are pure in heart, with all our heart, soul, and mind, and that we might love our neighbors as ourselves. Jesus said, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Jesus always calls people to look deeper, to see beneath the surface of things, to behold a deeper reality. Things, words, and actions are not all they appear to be. There's more. The commandments are not an end in themselves. They are meant to be followed by the faithful toward their fulfillment. Hand in hand with God's Messiah and one another, we enter the realm of God where there is an ancient wisdom and rule of life that transforms us so that we will become instruments of love divine, expressing God's deepest desire on earth and in heaven. Let us pray. Lord God, mercifully receive the prayers of your people. Help us to see and understand the things we ought to do, to honor those around us by living truthfully and with integrity, regarding each person as your precious child. Amen.